Hey guys, this is Wojtek from Jolly Monster Studio, and today we're going to kick off a new series of videos talking about the player character. Specifically, we're going to look at enhancing our third-person player character from the starter project that Epic provides with various new skills and behaviors. We're going to break down those mechanics into their various components, like animations, input binding, the actual rules and logic that go into all these cool features we see all of our favorite characters perform in video games. In addition to that, we're also going to look at spicing up our player character interaction with some cool cinematic cutscenes. Anyway, in addition to that, we're going to look at adding in new animations, turning those animations into various usable skills. We'll add in sound effects, particle emitters, all kinds of neat stuff to make our character kind of badass. A little bit like that. But I think we can do better, so let's stretch out. There we go. One more. One more. Let's do another one. Oh, there we go. So, now that we're all stretched out, let's get into the first video tutorial. This one's going to be talking about the punch. Oh yes, and we're going to try to do as much of this programming as we can in C++. To kick off the lesson, I've gone ahead and created a starter project for us to work from. If you go to my GitHub repository, under the repository section, you will notice there's a series player character part 1 project, which will contain everything we're going to work from. Now this includes the various animations as well as a couple of helpful little log functions that we're going to use to print some stuff onto the screen. You will also notice under the branch that there is a part 1 end branch, and that is basically the finished product from the end of our lesson. So if you want to skip all the way to the end, there it is. So with our project downloaded, we can now go ahead and pop open Unreal and just take a look at what we have here. So I've included this new folder called Tutorial Resources, and this is going to contain our new animations that we're going to use for punching, as well as the Mixamo rig in case you would like to bring in any other animations for your player character. All of these animations were lifted from Mixamo, so if you want to see how that process was done, please check out my other video where I talk about how do we import stuff from Mixamo into Unreal and then remap it to the Unreal mannequin. But with our animations in place, we can go ahead and start working on this tutorial. So the first thing we want to do, because the third-person player character sample project doesn't come with any additional key bindings, is we actually want to add in the keys that are going to control our player attack. So if you go to Settings, Project Settings, and then navigate down to Input, you'll notice that we already have a couple of action mappings, as well as some axis mappings that handle our movement, our looking around, or turning, things like that. So in this case, we're going to introduce a new action called Attack. And we are going to bind that action to our mouse left button. Cool. So with that in place, we can now switch over to Visual Studio and start mapping our key bindings to some sort of attack functions. So in this case, we're going to pop open Visual Studio, and already open I have my player character, both the header and the CPP file. And before we start binding our inputs, let's just take a look at what I've added in sort of outside of the standard boilerplate third-person character code. So we have these 3 enums that I've included. One is the log level, one is the log output, as in where are those log messages going to go, and then last is the attack type of melee fist. And we're not really going to get into this as part of this tutorial, but I kind of threw it in there to pique your curiosity and be a baseline for future videos. Okay, so let's take a look at these log levels. Why are they here? What are they doing? Who really cares about them? What I've done is towards the bottom of the player CPP class, I've included these two new functions. And if we scroll down in our header, you'll notice they're right here. So one is log, and it takes in a log level as well as our message of fstring. And then the other one is basically the same thing, but it also contains the log output override in case we want to push things out to the console, push things out to a file, or what have you. So we have options later on. Cool. Now, what's happening within these log functions is they're fairly straightforward. Essentially what I'm doing is just determining different color settings for our display log messages. So these are the things that are going to show up in the top left part of our screen. And these are the excuse me, these are the messages that are going to go into our output log. So again, we have kind of two ways of obtaining this information. Sounds pretty complicated. It really isn't, and it will help us later on as we build up this character. So we have our new action binding, our attack. So let's hook that up to our player character. And you'll notice under Setup Player Input Components, there is already a whole bunch of different mappings for the various other functions we saw as part of our input settings. So we're just going to go to the bottom of method signature here and include our new attack bindings. So we are going to call the player input component, and we're going to bind an action. And the primary difference between bind action and bind access is the access is going to push up a float that represents sort of the range of that axis. So if we turn our left joystick from left to right, that value, that movement of that joystick is going to be transposed into the bind access functions. In this case, our bind action is just going to be kind of an using it, not using it type of implementation. So these method signatures don't take in any input parameters. They're simply going to just be voids that are going to do some stuff when the user presses those buttons. So to bind action, you want to reference the name of your action. In this case, it's attack. And we're going to trigger something when it's pressed. We're going to pass in ourselves. And I do apologize for the various typos, as that is going to happen a bunch. So you'll notice I'm passing this bind attack, or this bind action of attack, to this method of attack, which we don't have defined yet, but we'll get to that in a second. And actually, we're going to call this attack start, and then we're essentially going to do the exact same thing below, except we are going to change pressed to released. And this is going to signify attack end. So cool, we have our two binding actions, and now let's create these method signatures. So going back to our header file, you now have the option of sort of deciding how do you want to present these methods to the callers of said methods. Do you want to make them private? Do you want to make them public? We have all kinds of different ways we can delineate them. In this case, I'm going to make them protected. And this is going to allow us to leverage these methods if we ever, extend this class for other purposes. So in this case, we're just going to create a void function of attack start. No parameters are being passed in, and this is going to be just get some commenting here. So attack start is going to be triggered when the player initiates an attack. Cool. And then we're going to do attack end. And this is going to be our ending method. So we have our two new method signatures. We have them bound to our attack buttons, and now let's do something with them. So this is a perfect opportunity to leverage one of our log statements. So void, and we're going to reference our character, and then we're going to reference our new method and create its implementation. So in here, all we're going to do is we're just going to log a level of, let's go info, with a message of function. Now, what function is this helper that essentially is going to print out where this log message is coming from. So in this case, we are referencing through our punch kick character class, attack method, or attack start method. And that's what this should print. So going just a little bit below, we're going to now pop in our secondary method of attack end. And we're going to do the exact same thing. Just print off the message that everything is running. So let's rebuild our project. Okay, so now that this is finished rebuilding, let's take a look at Unreal. And here's our player character. If we pop him open, hey, cool. As I'm clicking my left mouse button, I'm starting to get some logging messages on the screen. Excellent. And all this really tells us is we have our key binding working. Now let's move on to some more fun stuff. Okay, so with our player in place, we now need to start figuring out, well, how do we bind these cool animations to our player character? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage an animation montage to allow us to play these various animations from our code. And the way I'm going to go about doing that is I'm just going to create a new animation montage in the Utility Resources Animations folder. So if you right click, go to Animation, and then scroll down to Animation Montage, you will now be presented with a skeleton window. Now what this allows you to do is pick which of these skeletons you're going to use as the baseline for all your various animations. So if you have many skeletons with different animation sets, this is where you now make those distinctions. So we're going to go ahead and pick our UE4 mannequin skeleton. We are going to call this montage a melee fist attack montage. And you'll notice a bunch of the various animations already have kind of a naming convention. Medium right jab, slow right cross, slow right hook. So I'm trying to kind of get into the habit of labeling things correctly for easier reuse, and then we can use these conventions to kind of quickly get around our system when needed. So let's pop open our animation montage. With our animation montage open, we are presented with a whole pile of different settings. On the left hand side, you'll see there's a bunch of stuff going on the right hand side, there's stuff going on, and there's a big chunk here in the middle that allows us to essentially categorize and group different animation sequences in very specific orders by using these things called sections. And what sections allow us to do is basically slice up an animation's start and end parts and then reference them from within our code. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I take our fast left hook and I drag it over into our animation section, what it does is it brings in the animation, and then when I play it back, it just plays back in its regular sort of definition. So let me pause that, rewind it back to the beginning, and you'll notice right at the bat the Unreal Engine has created this default section, and it's this little chunk that you can kind of move around, and if it's the only one there, it's not going to be very good at being manipulated. You actually need to add a couple more, otherwise it expects something always at the beginning of the montage section. So let's add a new section, and I'll just call it, test. And now you'll notice under the sections tab we have default and test, and that means that Unreal has recognized this starting bit and then this starting bit. And if I clear these sections, you'll notice that they're kind of independently organized And when we play things back, the playback only goes as far as starting section 1, starting section 2. And if we drag this guy over to the left, we'll start from this point, but what I was trying to show you is if we go back to the beginning, the duration of the animation is now much, much longer. So this is quite powerful. It allows us to do all kinds of stuff with our animations. If we want to play them back in specific sort of sections, we can take a chunk of an animation and just play it back in reverse, let's say. All kinds of flexibility and freedom the montage offers us. So let's get rid of this section, and let's add in a new section that we're going to use in our code. So I'm going to call this start_1, and I'm also going to create a new section called end_1. And the reason I'm creating a start and ending section is I want explicit control over where this punch begins and ends. And I could have done it from, sort of start 1 and then start 2 for my second animation, but this just gives me a little bit more control. Now, the way you do it, once you have your animations, your notifies, your sections in place, you take your very first one, you drag her over to the left, and then you take your, default section, drag it over to the right, and just turf it. Now you got start 1 and end 1. And what I'm going to do for end 1 is just drag it over all the way to the right. Cool. So now we have our two sections, and let's clear them out. Great. Looks good. So we can save this guy and then go back to our code to actually start referencing this animation montage. Now the first thing we want to do is we want to copy the reference for our animation montage, as we're going to be pasting that into our code here over on the left hand side. Now with our code open, we're going to introduce a new property on our player character that allows us to reference the animation montage. So we're going to create a new U property, and we're going to call this our melee fist attack montage. And we are going to create a new property. It'll be visible anywhere. And we are going to also allow us to edit the defaults. That means whatever we define in our constructor for our player character, we will also have the ability then to modify at runtime through our player character blueprint. So let's go ahead and add in that setting. Actually, sorry, let's get rid of visible anywhere. Let's just edit defaults only, and then blueprint read only. Our category is going to be animation, and we will allow privates. Okay, so there's our property definition, and what this is going to reference is anim montage. And this is our melee fist attack montage. Great. So we have our new property in place, and this is now going to, this is going to allow us to bind our properties to the blueprint. Without this, we would only be able to reference things from our code. So let's do that now. In our CPP file, right in the constructor, what we're going to do is reference something called constructor helpers that allow us to basically either find classes, find objects, and they have a whole bunch of different bits of functionality and sort of utility methods that are just really quite helpful. In this case, we're just going to use find object. So in our constructor, we're going to want to load our animation montage, and that is going to be done using our construction helpers. And you'll notice there's a whole bunch of different methods here that assist us with retrieving stuff from within the Unreal Engine resource space. So we're going to do an object finder, and with this guy we're going to reference our montage class, and we're going to call this, sure, montage, but it's going to be a object. And then you pass in a text reference of the location of whatever it is you're trying to find. So in this case, it's our montage. And again, if you are uncertain how I obtain this, if you go back to Unreal and you right-click on any of your assets, you can say copy reference. So here, let's grab this just for example. Go back to our Visual Studio, and you'll notice it just brings in that reference definition. So great, we have our construction helper trying to find our montage object, and now we want to validate that it actually succeeded. So if that loaded and it passed, then we can go ahead and retrieve the actual montage out of this little container object. So we take our uMontage reference and we say, get me the object from this thing I just loaded with that type of object. Oh, and I'm sorry, that is not a pointer reference, but rather just standard old dot notation. Cool. So we are bringing in our montage and we're loading it at runtime. So if we rebuild this, we will notice that our player character, when we look at its blueprint, which is under third-person CPP, blueprints, third-person character, now its animation section under class defaults contains the reference to our animation montage. And you'll notice it brought in our animation montage by default, because that's what we have in our constructor, but it also provides us with the option to override these settings with any other montages we may get. So cool, we're kind of halfway there. So we've got our third-person character, we got the montage assigned. Well, now how do we play it back? So there's a couple of different ways we can do that. If we go back to Visual Studio and we go down to our attack function, or attack start function, we are going to reference our montage and then basically trigger the playing of. So to do that, there's this helpful little method called play animation montage, and it's already recognized my type. And then we're going to pass in the speed of the montage, the play rate. So in this case, if we have 1 float, that means we're going to play it at a steady sort of default rate moving forward in time. If I were to change this to a -1, it would reverse that operation. So going back to our play animation montage call, the other thing that it requires is a start section name. And going back to our editor, this is why you want to have, some common conventions, because if you're going to be referencing these sections a lot, you want to write this code kind of once and then reuse as much as we can. So in this case, we want to call start1. Going back to our code, we're now going to say, hey, fname, and we're going to say start1. Okay, let's compile that and just make sure everything is still running. Everything's recompiled. Now let's go back to our game. No animations. That's a little bit of a problem. No exceptions, so things must be working, but nothing's playing. The reason nothing is playing is our player character animation blueprint has no reference to our animation montage. So if we pull up our mannequin and go to its animation blueprint, and we pull up the anim graph, you'll notice we have basically our state machine, which is idle, run, jump, start. And then we have final animation pose. Nothing in here really allows us to reference our montage. Now, you'll notice also in the montage there's this little thing called a default slot. And what this really means is we also have, what this means is we have a reference point that our animation blueprints can now sort of piggyback off of in order to reference this montage. So if you right click within the animation blueprint and you look for something called slot, you will notice under montage there's this thing called a default slot. And this is directly referencing this default group and this default slot parameter that we have defined. So that's not bad, but let's add something a little bit more descriptive so we can kind of keep tabs on this stuff as we move along through our lessons. So let's add a new slot, and we're going to call this slot upper body. And we'll also add a new group, and we're going to call this group our player character. So I'll take our, sorry, I'm just going to move it so it's under player character. Cool, there's upper body and player character. Let's save that and go back to our animation blueprint. If we right click again and go to slot, you'll notice this default slot guy, when we expand its settings, now contains our player character upper body section. So that's cool. If we now take our default state machine, plug it into our slot upper body and into our final animation pose, this should now basically push all of our sort of locomotion poses through this definition when available and spit out a final animation pose. So there's our thing. There's our guy. And it's still not playing. So what else can we do with this to kind of make it become available? Well, we can't just kind of shove it in directly because it's just not the way the engine works. But if we right click and we say blend, we have a whole bunch of different ways of blending multiple poses against each other. And what this really means is I'll be able to control at which point in time an animation is available to our final animation pose. So do I use the state machine definition? Do I use the montage? So in this case we're going to use the layered blend per bone. And what this allows us to do is essentially blend these two animations across different bones within our skeleton. So if we just take our upper body, we take our locomotion pose and we blend it with our upper body pose and we just push it out to our final animation pose, what we get is, again, not a heck of a lot. And that is because this upper body really has no information coming into it. And you'll notice if I drag off my locomotion pose, it just flips back around. So I have no way of kind of reusing this default state of animation information across multiple animation channels. But what we can do is if we take our default pose and we drag the line off of it and we look for a cache, what this is going to do is push essentially the animation state into a variable, into a container that we then can reuse for, various nefarious means. So this is going to be our cached locomotion. And then what we can do is we can right click, find our cached locomotion, and pop it into our upper body. Likewise, we can copy and paste this guy and then pop it into our the other animation stream. So these two guys should now blend together. And if we compile it, the note section goes away saying, hey, this is looking much, much better. Now if we play our game, still nothing is blending. That's a bit of a problem. The reason for that is the layer blend per bone configuration. We really haven't done anything in here. We haven't configured how we want these things to blend. So let's pull up our layer blend per bone section, expand it, and let's add in a bone. Now, if you recall from my last tutorial when we were talking about bones and remapping of them, one thing you might have remembered is under the skeleton, there's all these different sort of spine, hip, root, pelvis, these various bones we can interact with. Now, for our exercise, what we would like to do is to have our top portion of the mannequin perform our punch animations, while the bottom portion remains active for locomotion. So essentially, you should be able to walk and punch at the same time. And to do that, we need to kind of determine where do we want that blending to occur. So probably not clavicle. Spine 3 is a little bit too high. We'll try with spine 0. It's kind of right in the center of the body, so we'll get that sort of that hip twist going as the punches are being thrown. So going back to layer blend per bone, our bone name is going to be spine 01. Spine 01. Our blend depth is going to be 1, which means we are essentially kind of at the root of that bone is where we're performing the blending options. And we are also going to have our mesh space rotation match with the blending. And I'll kind of show you what that means. So our attacks are still not going. And let's just take a quick look as to why not. Oh. So, we added our new slot section, but we forgot to actually set our animations to leverage that particular slot. So we just added that in, and now, if we play our game, oh look, there's our animation, and it's blending sort of right at the hip level. Now you'll notice the punch is kind of weird. It just doesn't behave as expected. The reason for that is the mesh space rotation blend setting has not been selected. So it's trying to play the animation kind of in the position that it was originating from, not how the character is currently facing and sort of orientating himself. So if we play it now, you'll notice the punch is much smoother. It's a lot more closer to what you would expect from sort of a right hook. Now, the hip twist is a little bit janky, so it works, but it feels just a little bit too clunky. And you can mess around with these various blend settings to kind of determine what is optimal for you. For example, I've noticed that with these animations, a blend depth of 2 kind of smooths things out from the initial hip. So you'll see his rotation isn't as wild. And if he were, wearing some sort of armor or, garments, they wouldn't twist and look unnatural. So again, you can play with these settings to kind of get it perfect. I like this one, so I'm going to go stick with this one. But yeah, we now have our punch animating, but there's still a couple problems with this, right? Because we just don't want the one punch. We want a bunch of different punches. So how do we expand on that? Going back to our animation montage, what we can now do is include a secondary section. So we're going to go here to our asset browser. We're going to take our medium right jab, and you'll notice that when it's playing, it's still not going to the second animation, but if I just fast forward, there's our right jab. So he'll go pop, and then you should go pop. Now, to kick this guy off, we also want to include a new section. So we're going to call this section, start _2. And we're going to kind of pop it right at the beginning of this punch. One little shortcut is if you hold down Control and navigate with your mouse wheel over this animation section, you can get a little bit more precise with where your section start and end. So I'm going to move up this little ending bit here. I'm going to pop my start just right at the beginning of that, and then I'm going to zoom out. Oops. Just going to undo that. Zoom out and add a new montage section of end _2. So there's our medium right jab. Cool. So we got that going. Let's go back to our game and just play all that back. Still only the one punch. Going back to Visual Studio, now what we can do is, you'll notice I'm explicitly calling section start 1, but I now have 2 sections, so how do I go about flipping between them? Well, we can do something very, very simple to get this going. We are going to simply we're going to generate this random number between 1 and 2, and we're going to call this integer, why don't we call this actually montage section index, and this is going to equals the rand call modulus 3 plus 1, and what this means, 2, is we're going to generate a number starting from 1 and ending at 2, and you're in between. And then we're going to create a new string reference for our animation section. So this is going to be area string animation section, and in here we're going to create a new f string called montage section, and this is going to be our start plus. And as you can see here, what we're doing is we're creating our section start, which is going to be hard-coded, and then we're passing in whatever random number between 1 and 2 that was generated up here. When we're done with this guy, all we have to do is just dereference, our montage section. And now when we play our animation montage, every time we hit, we should be able to switch between section 1 and 2. So we're just going to rebuild this project and test it out. Okay, everything's rebuilt. Let's pop open Unreal and see what's happening. So here's our guy. Punch 1, punch 1, punch 1, punch 2. Ooh, that's a little bit more exciting. Let's try that again. Right, 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 left. Pretty impressive. All of a sudden we have sort of the basis for a little bit of a combo system. Kind of cool. Now, there's still a pile of issues with this implementation, as you'll notice. If I just press the punch key, he kind of does this weird little I don't know what I'm doing, please decide player, I hate you, and then he throws the punch. So we have a lot of room for improvement, and we're going to continue this in our next set of videos. We're going to start adding in some sound and some collision and all kinds of neat and interesting bits. But let's take a look at the finished product with a couple of different montage sections. So I've gone ahead and cleaned up the project just a little bit, and let me show you what we have so far. So I've modified our montage to now include 3 sections, and if I play them back, we've got this little jab, a right strong hook, and these smaller right hooks. And the montage looks kind of like this. So we've got our first section, our second section, and our third section. The code is also pretty much the same. The only thing I did is I modified our random selection to include that third one. Now, in subsequent tutorials, we're going to be looking at how to make this a little bit more dynamic, so you don't need to explicitly define these ranges for every one of your montages. For that, we're going to use something called data tables, but that is for our next lessons. So I've gone ahead and modified this little guy here to include now 3 sections. Everything else is still in place, so just to kind of show you how quickly now we can flip between various montages for our player, let's go ahead and create a net new one. So we go to Animation, Animation Montage, we pick our mannequin, and we're going to call this Melee Fist Attack Montage _2. So this guy is kind of fresh, doesn't have anything set up in it. So let's change our section before we forget to upper body. And this one, yeah, why don't we do the slow right hook? There's that guy, and it's going to be also mixed in with this elbow uppercut. So we're going to do a right hook, and then we can come in and do this little bam bam move. And similar to our other montage, we'll add in the third one. Because if we don't, what's going to happen is we're going to get 3 coming in as part of our randomized index. It's not going to be able to find in the section, and things are just going to blow up. And there we go. So we've got right hook, that guy, and a medium jab. Cool. Let's add in our sections. Start one. Little beginning. Let's get rid of our default. End one. Over here towards the end. Just zoom in just a tiny bit. Okay. Start 2. Let's put that at the beginning. Moving over to the right. And 2. New montage section, start 3. Start 3, and then we just need 3. And again, I do realize I don't need the ending sections, but believe me, they do come in handy, and we'll get to that later. So we'll clear our sections just to make sure everything is still playing back as expected. Oops, sorry. I'm just going to zoom all the way out. There we go. So there's our one section, just keeps playing over. Start 2. Start 3. Oh, that's a problem. And let's play back start 3. Okay, cool. So this new montage is saved. It's got 3 sections. It is set to the upper body. Now, let's go back to our player blueprint. Pop that guy open. And let's select our secondary montage. Compile, save. And now we play things back. You'll notice we have our new montage. So just to quickly recap our lesson, we went ahead and created new key bindings. We assigned those key bindings to our attack functions. The attack function makes a reference to our montage, which is loaded via a variable that we expose through our blueprint, as well as our constructor reference, which is explicit. So if this path ever changes, if you move things around, this is going to blow up, so tread carefully. With that montage in place, we also kicked off the various sections of the montage as part of playing back our attacks by creating these sections with start underscore 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. We also created a new slot on the body that is referenced within the blending animation piece of the animation blueprint. So thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to showing you guys some more what we can do with the player character in our next videos. We'll see you next time.